Hello. Today we are looking at how mainstream economics derives supply curves. Basically, firms want to maximize profit at any given price. They have different ways of producing the good, using more or fewer workers and more or fewer machines. These different ways of making stuff are summarized in a so-called production function. The firm's optimization problem looks remarkably similar to that of the consumer. The utility function is replaced by a production function, and the optimum input bundle is chosen, depending on the price of labor and capital. This is the subject of lectures 5 to 8 of the MIT Principles of Micro online course, where you will find a much more in-depth and technical explanation of what I'm discussing here. I have put the link in the description. The optimization problem is slightly different from that of the consumer because, in principle, there's no constraint on the money that can be spent. Instead, there's assumed to be a competitive constraint on the amount of output that can be sold. Effectively, the size of the firm's market is constrained by its competitors. The firms take market prices as given. So then the question becomes, given that you can sell a certain amount of output, what's the least costly way to do it? The production function for firms is like the utility function for consumers. You plug in a certain amount of capital and labor, and the production function tells you how much you can produce. You then go and choose the technology that has the lowest cost, which depends on the relative productivity of capital and labor on the one hand, and the prices of capital and labor on the other. Okay, so how is the firm's problem represented graphically? Once the firm has decided how much to produce, it looks for the least costly way of producing it. In this picture, if the firm chooses to produce output of Q1, it looks for the point on the blue isoquant that is least costly. Costs are represented by isocost lines. Each isocost line shows a different amount of cost, and its slope is determined by the prices of labor and capital. The firm wants to be on the lowest isocost line possible, which is the one where the two curves touch. In this case, lowest cost is achieved with a capital-labor combination QC-QL. At this point, the price ratio of labor to capital prices is equal to their relative productivity. If one factor were relatively more productive than its relative price, it would be better to use more of it. Of course, you'd have to make sure that the revenue you get from selling Q1 output is more than your total costs. Otherwise, you make a loss and should shut shop rather than produce. By assumption, in a competitive market, revenue equals cost. If revenue is below cost, firms drop out or reduce their size. Supply decreases and price increases until revenue covers cost. The assumption that profits are zero in effect means that capital earns the same return in all companies. So it's actually not zero profit, it's zero excess profit above the market rate of return for capital. This graph shows the long-run optimization problem. In the short run, at least one factor is assumed to be fixed, and the point where the isoquant touches the isocost curve is not necessarily the point where you maximize profit. So what happens in the short run? Let's assume that capital is fixed. So we have only the decision to hire workers. Every additional worker costs the same wage and increases total production. The assumption is that each additional worker is less productive than the previous one and adds fewer additional units of output. That is the same as saying that marginal costs are rising. The marginal cost is defined as the cost of making an additional unit of output. If output price is P star, the firm maximizes profit if it chooses output Q star, where marginal cost equals price. Each unit of output generates a revenue of P star. And as long as the marginal cost for producing that output is below that price, you make a profit on each extra unit. That's why production is expanded until price and marginal cost are equalized. Effectively, the marginal cost line is the firm's supply curve. How does this relate to the previous isoquant diagram? In this graph, the point where the isoquant touches the isocost curve is where average costs are minimized. That's where the optimal capital-labor combination is achieved, given input prices. So in this graph, in the short run, you're using less capital and more labor than would be optimal in the long run. In the long run, all factors of production can be changed to optimize production. There are essentially three alternative long-run cost curves depending on circumstances. The yellow curve shows increasing average costs. Sometimes economists will call that decreasing returns to scale. As you double inputs, you less than double outputs. However, when they explain decreasing returns to scale, there's always an input that's not doubled, like land. So really, this curve is the result of a limit on a factor rather than decreasing returns to scale. In the case of constant returns to scale, you double inputs and that doubles outputs, which seems to be a commonsensical situation. Decreasing average costs is often described as increasing returns to scale. You double inputs and more than double outputs. Again, this is a misnomer because the cases when this happens are mostly when you've got excess capacity of an input that is not doubled. Like a railway network you can run trains on. Note that increases in productivity shift these costs downwards. This all looks pretty straightforward until you try to understand the details. In the first instance, what do we mean by a production function? It sounds straightforward. You put inputs into the function and get output. But if you think about it, each point in this function represents a different way of producing stuff, and you can't jump from one to the other just like that. The marginal cost curve depends on factors being substitutable. But can you really add or remove a worker to an optimized production line? You may perhaps hire an entire shift and run the line for longer, but there are clear limits to this idea in many instances. In practice, the production function looks probably more like a set of isolated points than a smooth function, and the optimization methods used in economics don't really work that well, especially when you bring technical change and competition into play. Secondly, what is capital? Professor Gruber says it's buildings, machines, the stuff that workers use to make things. Okay, that makes sense. However, it's important to understand that capital is defined in the production function in terms of its monetary value. It is the amount of money spent on capital, not specific machines or buildings. The cost of capital is the interest rate, which is defined as a percentage on a certain amount of money invested, not on a certain amount of real capital. So the production function is not as tangible as Professor Gruber says it is. The tangible machines are in the background and are bought with the money capital that is shown in the production function. This leads to a fundamental problem with the whole setup. Say interest rates or wages change, then prices change, including the price of machines. This means that a certain amount of capital in the production function now equates to a different amount of real capital than before, which means that the whole production function changes. The production function is therefore only defined for a specific value of input costs. As soon as those change, you've got a new production function. These problems were discussed in the so-called Cambridge Capital Controversy in the 1950s and 60s, but never addressed in the mainstream approach. So what you have here is an inconsistent and theoretically invalid theory of the firm. Thank you for watching.